I think that we can sometimes, and I've been guilty of it, put the cart before the horse. And I think that it may come from AFL and the focus on generic skills, whether they be in reading and writing. And for instance, if I give you an example, the idea of teaching students to analyze text. Obviously, we need to do that. They need to be able to look at a new text in a range of different genres and be able to pick it apart and to analyze it. The problem is that they have to bring an awful lot of knowledge to the table in the first instance to be able to do this. And I think that over the years, certainly from my experiences, that as a teacher, I've spent too long trying to fast track them onto being able to analyze without really realizing the huge knowledge base that relies on in the first place. I've called it before in a blog that I wrote, the as the crow flies era, the attempt to sort of move them on really, really quickly without realizing that actually we need to start by ensuring that they have a strong background knowledge as they're before and as they're reading a text. And also a similar thing applies with writing.
Okay. How does that work in a sort of a lesson scenario then? What does that look like in your average lesson?
In a lesson? Well, I would actually be thinking beyond a lesson. I mean, I think that there is an issue that we have over prioritized and sort of given too much value to the individual lesson. You know, a lesson is a unit of time. It is a stepping stone towards a much sort of higher goal. I mean, one approach that I've really liked and putting into practice myself is the one that Joe Kirby shares on knowledge organisers. The idea that actually before a scheme of work, and the same before a lesson, I suppose, that you make sure you know exactly what content you want the students to know and to learn, and that you teach with the hope that, and I suppose this is the mastery approach, but at the end of that unit, they are going to know that stuff and they're going to be able to take it away and apply it into new contexts. So rather than trying to think about nifty ways of teaching kids how to analyze or how to pull apart, you know, make alternative interpretations of a text, we need to actually sit down and decide beforehand, well, what are the key ideas we're going to teach them about that text? What, you know, strategies and techniques has the writer used? What kind of contextual information are we going to share so that the students are really can make good insights into the text? So, for instance, I'm teaching Jekyll and Hyde at the moment, and started off by looking at some of, you know, Stevenson's life, and particularly the influence of the Deacon Brodie story. Deacon Brodie was a well-established member of Edinburgh society who had a dark side. At night time, he went around as a head of a gang of robbers. Also ideas about Freud, about the end of the century fears that Stevenson was sort of tapping into, and that stuff is stuff that we explicitly teach them and expect them to learn. And those high level academic interpretations are not something we hope that they develop through having a chat with each other, or hope that they develop through doing a Google search, and some of them will do that, but they're things that we actually teach them, and then we really encourage them to make the connections. And the hope is then that next time they're reading a Victorian text, that they can actually apply some of that to it. I would suggest that you, when you move between text and text at an early stage in a child's reading career, I suppose, that they don't make that transfer very easily. And whether at secondary school they can make that transfer is another question. But I think that quite often we'll be teaching a 19th century text, and it will be the first time that child has actually read a 19th century text. And to expect them to make their own interpretations, to expect them to be able to take that text apart, even in some cases to understand the basic plot line and the difficulty of the syntax and the vocabulary, is a step too far. And I think we should be focusing our attention as teachers, as departments, and our CPD should be focusing on the content. What are we teaching them? Because only then will they be able to go away and read another text and perhaps, fingers crossed, begin to apply it.
So obviously that works really well as approach for contextual things, but on a unit-based sort of level. But on I'm thinking about back to your blog on inferences and can we teach inferences. You've used that example of mice and men with the word bridled. So on a sort of micro level, you know, presumably you're thinking ahead of the lesson, well, what knowledge deficit could there be here?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. And then from that, you're kind of mapping out a whole unit thing with things like context, authority, but you're also thinking, what do they need to know today to be able to do the analysis? Not just here's the analysis, they'll work it out.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that in terms of lesson planning, if you can second guess an issue or a knowledge gap they're likely to have, you can't always, and that's why you need to be responsive to the moment as well. Then you need to consider, or we need to consider as English teachers, how to prepare. I mean, vocabulary knowledge is the most sort of obvious first place to go. Just asking a class, and it's a really good activity, just giving a class a text and asking them, well, what don't you understand here, can be very illuminating. The research that I've read tends to have a slightly cautious approach towards the idea that students can attack a word and pick it apart and work out what it means by, you know, looking at prefixes and suffixes. I mean, it is a helpful thing to be able to do, and I do actually, when I'm teaching new vocabulary, do pull words apart in that way. But I think the idea that we teach students a set of skills to attack a word is actually quite unhelpful, because as we know about fluency and comprehension, if you have to stop in the middle of a sentence, and if you're reading a highly meandering, complex Dickensian sentence, you are going to lose the thread of your thought and you won't understand it. So I mean, if you read the work of Isabel Beck and the robust vocabulary stuff, we need to be thinking of ways, and this is pre-teaching, of making sure it doesn't have to be pre-teaching. Obviously, it can be in the moment of the lesson, or it can be after you've read the text. We need to be sure that that they understand it. And so, in terms of lessons, pre-teaching some content, I think is a valuable idea.
And you kind of touched a little bit on there, and I'm interested to hear about what your approach then is to unseen fiction, because obviously there's now huge elements of the new GCSE that are unseen. I think that's across the board. Obviously, I'm more familiar with the AQA board, but how does that alter your approach then to unseen? Because obviously there's huge amounts of content that you can't teach there.
No, and that I mean, that's where you come back to a broad and rich curriculum, starting from reception, I suppose. Many children will, particularly in the school I'm in now, come with quite a lot of cultural capital, and probably many of those will be able to cope with those texts. But that's to do with curriculum, and when kids come in Year 7, they should be reading tough tough text. They should be reading, there's nothing wrong with reading out loud. Doug Lemov in his Reading Reconsidered book, if you've read that, really does place a huge importance on the idea that actually, as teachers, we should be teaching text which is slightly above the level that the child can read at. And I found myself in a strange situation recently where I was reading a text to students and realizing that the text that I was reading at home to my 5-year-old had more linguistic density in terms of the vocabulary and the sentence structures. And I think that this is a huge issue, and it may actually, the answer to the question may actually lie in Key Stage 3 in terms of secondary. That we need to get them reading these texts from a younger age, getting used to the complex sentence structures, the syntax, the general sort of tropes of that kind of writing. So therein lies the answer, I think, I mean, my approach always to unseen poetry wasn't to teach them unseen poetry, but was to teach them seen poetry well. And then later on, once they've read quite a number of poems in different genres, they understand a number of different techniques and approaches that poets take, that then they have the knowledge to attack or to take apart and, to analyze an unseen poem better. So my approach would be to actually, I mean, I hate the word, but to front load it, to make sure that there is, where you can, there is the knowledge, the experience of text. And then as we move towards the exams in year 11, then they have to get into the practice of looking at text on their own. So it's a two-part thing. First of all, start by making sure that the knowledge is in place. Use Key Stage 3 to make sure that the technical vocabulary, the grammatical vocabulary, not only the knowledge, but the understanding of those concepts is in place. And then in Key Stage 4, you've got more room then to allow students more sort of less guidance when they're reading these texts. The problem is that too many kids come in at Key Stage 4 not ready for it. And as a result, you find yourself in a position where you're throwing 19th century extracts at them and they can't read them. And you're into a hiding for nothing really there. They've got to pass the exam, and they get to that practice stage, which you need before exams, where you need to take away the guidance, where they need independence. You get to that point when they're not ready for it, and you're throwing them in the deep end. You know it's not working, but you're forced to do it. So it's hard.
Yeah. So you've mentioned there a little bit about sort of, I suppose, what Daniel Coyle in the Talent Code talks about as pattern play. Not dispensing entirely with a skills-based approach, but seeing it more as repetitions of sequences that work. Is that the kind of idea? It's not
very much so. I think
that Joe Kirby talked.
Yeah, I think that once an idea of a curriculum should be that you do remove some of the scaffolds as you move through. And I think once you get to exams, if you want students to pass exams, and let's face it, we do, if they've had a rich and engaging and interesting curriculum up until the last few months, and then you say to them, look, we need to get into these habits of how to approach a text, how to pull it apart. I would suggest that this is another form of knowledge, that it's a process knowledge, where you're using your sort of the background knowledge that you have to apply it in different ways and get used to applying it. I think I'm quite happy for using extracts, but the problem with extracts is that when the knowledge isn't in place in the first place, you're just further compounding the problem.
Okay. So, I mean, you've talked there about process knowledge. Is that just rebranding skills? I mean, that kind of thing.
I think to an extent it is rebranding skills. But the good thing about the idea of process knowledge is that you're teaching them a process, and this is where ideas like modelling that we share, most English teachers use, and we wrote a chapter about it in making every lesson count book, that actually modelling is about sort of it's a mixture of demonstration, but also explicitly talking students through your thought processes, and then perhaps giving them a structure to use when they're working independently. My problem with things like analysis and evaluation and things is that if they don't have, if the kids, many children, if they don't have a key process in mind, they won't be able to do it. So for me, I prefer the idea of process knowledge, but I'm quite happy to call it skills if that's what other people want to call it. I mean, it may well be the same thing, but you can't have process knowledge without some background knowledge to put into place. I think there's also an issue with writing, and it's something that I learnt over the last couple of years, that say I was teaching rhetorical writing, and in general, a scheme of work on rhetorical writing would involve looking at some famous speeches across the years, putting them apart, looking at the strategies, looking at things like ethos, pathos, and logos, and you know, doing all that stuff, getting them to understand and learn them, and then at the end of the scheme, you'd ask them to write their own speech. And what I would say, and I'm probably not the only one, is, okay, ladies and gents, go away and research a topic and then write your own speech. That works for some, but the problem lies in the fact that you might have taught them some of these underlying concepts of rhetorical writing, but often they haven't got the surface knowledge on the topic that they pick. So let's say they pick euthanasia, or which is the classic one, or the death penalty, or gun laws in the US, or whatever, that actually they haven't got the surface knowledge to be able to sift through that information, to pick out what's useful and what isn't useful. And the speeches that they write are awful. And they may even use some of the techniques, but the speeches have no power, are not based on, are not rooted in the real life debate and discipline that they should be. So actually I found that teaching them explicitly about one of those topics, even if it meant less work on the rhetorical techniques, led to better writing. And so ultimately I think that if you're turning it around that way, you've always got to be thinking about the surface knowledge as well as the deep conceptual knowledge that you want them to use. And some students will go away and create excellent speeches on those lines, but a lot of them won't. And that's that interplay, and that's why I think sometimes that putting knowledge first in your thinking as a teacher can revolutionize the way that you think about not just lessons, but across lessons and schemes of work and how one thing builds on from another. Ultimately, it's about curriculum, really, about the organization and sequencing, and the common sense of the curriculum, I think.
So in terms of that process knowledge, then, are you kind of forwarding the idea of, are we working towards a sort of an acronym for analysing poetry, or is it more complex than that? Is that a useful signpost on the route?
I think in the first instance, when they're still novices, I suppose, then I'm not against some acronyms being used as part of the process. There's kind of been an anti-acronym backlash, say against things like PE and writing. But actually, I think sometimes sometimes you'll see the PE structure being used in an awesome piece of writing, and sometimes you'll see it in a very weak piece of writing. So I'm not sure it's the structure that's the issue there, but that's beside the point. I do think that tick list approaches where you give them 4 or 5 things you want them to do when they get a new poem or an extract to do on their own, as you guiding them through it, model it first of all, obviously, and then show them how you use the tick list, and then let them have a go on their own with the tick list, with the view that in the long run, and for those, you know, of the more able students who are already there, that's a starting point, and that they will ultimately move on to take on greater and greater independence in the kind of way that they look at the poem. So there is a subtlety there, because that sort of approach, a very sort of strict, guided approach to process knowledge, can hinder as well as help. So there is a subtlety that goes into all teaching, which is about knowing the students, knowing the topic at hand, and being prepared to have some level of flexibility, I think.
Okay. So I think we've covered, and you've made it sound incredibly sensible, and I think that's probably because it is, the idea of knowledge base, moving towards a process knowledge, and then moving towards stripping back all of those elements so that what you're left with is the student's sort of authentic literary critic or authentic writer or whatever.
Well, I think it's the idea of authenticity is really hard. I mean, to be honest with you, I imagine most English teachers are like me. When they get a new text and a new poem, they go out and find out what other people are saying about it. Well, you know, what are the really interesting interpretations of this poem? What are other teachers doing with it? What does the literary criticism say about this poem? So we as teachers resort to the knowledge that's out there. You know, despite the fact that we're experts in our subjects, we go out and seek the expertise of others. So the idea that a 16-year-old can make authentic literary criticism is, I have seen it. I've seen you know, we've all seen writing from 16-year-olds that's better than we could have done at that age, or possibly we could do now, but it's few and far between. And for those of us working with a lot of disadvantaged students, and working in towns and areas where there isn't a university and most parents don't have that background, the idea is moving towards perhaps more authenticity rather than complete authenticity, certainly at the age of 16 anyway.
So I suppose that's kind of covered the element, and I think, like I said, you have made it sound really sensible, and I think that is just because it is. I think it'd be remiss of me not to present the fundamental skills-based knowledge, skills-based sort of approach argument of, well, then aren't you just spoon-feeding them? Where do you kind of stand on that kind of token argument?
I think it is an interesting argument, but I suppose, you know, how can you know what you don't know? That's the spoon feeding. I mean, spoon feeding at its worst is, you know, doing the work for students. And I've been talking about ever growing independence, you know, within lessons, across schemes of work, and over time, removing the scaffolds. And the research into that is pretty clear that if you're going to use supports, you have to take those away. So spoon feeding in the first instance is teaching, really. It's explaining, it's modelling, it's telling kids stuff they need to know. And the fact is, if you've got a number of sophisticated interpretations of a 19th century novel that your teacher has given you, I'm pretty sure that the next 19th century novel you come to, you're more likely to be able to come up with some of your own, or more likely to have some inkling about where you might find those than you would be if the teacher hadn't given them to you. I mean, I remember my first ever top set class 10 years ago when I started teaching. And, you know, I would think, well, they're clever. They should be able to do it themselves. And so, you know, I would be doing things like dividing a poem up into verses and getting the class to teach each other. Or I would be, you know, sending them home to do the analysis part, or putting them in the groups to discuss it. And that first top set class, bright kids, 4 of them got A's and the rest fell below. And it was awful, you know, and I changed my approach. I became more didactic. I did two things. I really made sure that I was giving them the high level ideas, and also I was modeling. I was using examples of of top level analysis with them, showing them, writing them with them. And you compare, even though the students when they started with me are probably the same, if you compare my exam outcomes now to then, they're a world away. So it does work in terms of exams. I think that the more we know, the more curious we become to know more, and the more tools we're given to approach a new and novel problem. So while I understand the issue with spoon feeding, and I for one don't think that teachers should be spending the whole lesson talking, there needs to be more practice time, that the teacher introduces something, and depending on the class and depending on the difficulty of the topic, you might spend quite a lot of time talking about it. You might break it into smaller chunks. We know that the research shows us that sort of chunk, breaking down information, modeling it, explaining it, practicing it, it works. But the problem is, if you can convince me that young minds can, or any mind can discover something by magic, and sometimes I will hear really great interpretations from kids in class. We all do, and we say, yeah, I really love that, never thought of that, next time I'm teaching I'll use that, that's brilliant. They do, but I would suggest that's because you've been immersing them in a culture where you have been sharing those sort of ideas, and they're beginning to understand the discipline better. They're beginning to distinguish between a good idea and a bad idea in that subject. Nothing's ever clear cut. And when they start connecting ideas across texts, then that's where I think the magic starts to happen. So, some people, I mean, this is the traditional versus progressive argument. I would say I was broadly a soft traditionalist, with a few progressive sort of idiosyncrasies along the way. I mean, I'm quite happy for students to work in groups if they're behaving well and they're focused, and that they've already been taught the knowledge. It's great for getting them to connect things together. It's great for getting them to revise. We know that questioning things and explaining things helps you to remember it and to learn it and to process it. So, you walk into my classroom and you're not going to see me at the front always just telling kids stuff. You will see quite a bit of that. And there will be times where I feel like I have to spoon feed, particularly where I'm in that horrific sort of catch-22 situation where I know the students need to practice independently because they've got an exam coming up. Yet on the other hand, I kind of already realised that the knowledge isn't in place, and you're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea there, I think.
So it's not a baby out with the bathwater sort of thing. It's there are elements from a sort of NQT year style skills approach, but that are useful. But it's about using them correctly at the right time, having interleaved that knowledge.
Yeah, and I would only ever use group work with a group that did it properly, where every student in the class did it. And if the group don't, then we don't do group work. That's my approach to it.
So we've spoken a little bit about knowledge base. I think you've spoken a little bit about interleaving that knowledge so that when they return to a similar 19th century text, that they're ready for that they've got some basis there for that knowledge. In one of your blogs, I think it might actually be the same blog I referenced earlier, actually, you ended with the line, take care of the knowledge and the inferences will take care of themselves. Do you could you expand that out to the skills will take care?
Yeah, I mean, there's really the work of Daniel Willingham, I think, has been particularly instructive here, because when we're reading a text, we to make an inference, even on a basic, on a very basic level. Let's say we had two sentences. I'm looking at my kitchen now. So I walked into the kitchen, the oven was on. Okay. If you didn't know what a kitchen was and you didn't know what an oven was, you wouldn't understand that sentence. You have to make an inference. And if you didn't know that an oven is usually situated in a kitchen, then you would need further information. So I walked into the kitchen, and the kitchen is a place where people cook food. The oven was on, which is a machine used for heating heating food so that it cooks. There's the basic problem, but that was a very simplistic example. When students are reading harder texts, those inferences are harder. Ultimately, what Willingham argues is that any teaching of background knowledge is teaching reading. And there's a really famous study, and I can't remember the reference to it, where students of sort of high reading ability were pitted against students of much weaker reading ability. And they were asked to read a text about baseball, quite an in-depth text about baseball. And high reading ability kids, well, they weren't that knowledgeable about baseball. It wasn't their thing. The less able ones, the weaker readers, were experts in baseball. They loved baseball. And once they did comprehension questions on that text, it was actually the weaker readers who got most out of a text. And so when we read, we bring knowledge to the table. Unfortunately, we don't see that as teachers. And that background knowledge comes from a wide variety of experiences that child has had, both educational and not. And if we teach in a way where we only rely on the background knowledge the children have already, we are inadvertently, unwittingly, prejudicing the teaching against those from disadvantaged backgrounds, because they don't necessarily, or perhaps less able students, because they don't necessarily bring as much to the table. That's really, really hard to solve that problem. And I'm not saying it is completely solvable.
No, and I mean, obviously, a lot of the research, you use the word disadvantage there, a lot of the research points to the fact that it's not even a sense of how much do you parents earn, it's capital, which is the most significant one. So to then sort of say, well, I'm a progressive and I'm really, for social justice, but actually I'm going to not teach any knowledge is really struggle with that kind of as an approach, both politically and ideologically and pedagogically. I can't follow that line of thinking at all.
I agree. I think actually that most teachers do teach knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think most teachers English teachers realise that they need to. But what I suppose what I'm talking about is to make that open, is to make it the basis for, department meetings, CPD, how you plan the curriculum, how you set homework, getting kids to go home and revise, how you organise everything. And that's why I said knowledge first rather than knowledge based, because actually I think it's the cart and the horse metaphor again, really. I think that there is some use in telling students, and giving students the assessment objectives at Key Stage 4. They've got to be using technical terminology. They've got to be talking about the effect on the audience. They've got to be interpreting the writer's ideas, making links to context. That they're good sort of little, I suppose, metacognitive sort of reminders to the kids when they're writing, and it's good to show them how to write like that. But I think that happens. That has to happen in the context that actually those ideas have been taught in the first place. Now we're thinking about how to shape them into a sophisticated response.
So Thank you very much, Andy. I think that's pretty conclusive. Can I ask a little favour from you on behalf of sort of people just starting out at the moment? You know, a lot of people in their NQT years, even RQT years, probably taking huge chunks from this and thinking, I've got to change this week. What do those people change this week? You know, that perhaps the university side of things maybe hasn't prepared them for. I remember coming out of university, my PGC training was pretty good, I think, but I remember coming out with, you know, these ideas about group work. And so what do those people change this week? Let's finish there.
Well, first of all, I think this may be controversial, but I do think some universities and university lecturers are given a bit of a quite short shrift on Twitter, and sometimes I think it's unfair. And actually, some of the ideas that we're talking about aren't coming directly from universities. Some of them are also coming from schools as well. So a little bit of a defence, and I've worked quite closely with people from Brighton University recently, and you realise that they're not peddling myths. The myths are prevalent there already. But anyway, I think the one thing I would do, and one thing I probably should do next week, my lessons as well. The one thing that I would do is start by if you're reading a text, spend your planning time on reading that text, annotating it, and thinking about what knowledge your children will need to be able to understand that text. So maybe at the start of a lesson, you might explicitly teach them some vocabulary. Maybe you'll feed in an idea that will help them to understand the reading of that text. And be aware that if you set homeworks that asks children to go away and research something, ask yourself the question, is that extending on what they know, which might be useful, or should I actually be teaching that to them explicitly myself? Will they be able to do it? And if the answer's the second one, then teach it to them. Don't be afraid to teach. That would be my answer.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm kind of shortcutting there. I personally benefited from a really excellent PGC, and I'm just shortcutting that idea of.
I know, I'm not blaming you.
Stereotypical. Yeah, don't get me in trouble with my PGC tutor, Andy. She was an intimidating woman, a brilliant but intimidating woman.
I'll send her the link afterwards.
Please. No, she's very good. Debbie Hickman at University of Chichester, absolutely wonderful trainer. Yeah, I think we kind of covered all Andy. I think there's something there to take away from everyone, regardless of point of the career. I think you've concluded well there with that line that this is something you need to do this week. I think we all need to do it this week. And I wish somebody had kind of sat down with me at the start of my career and said, don't be afraid to teach. I think that's a wonderful message, because there is an element of that. There is an element of this idea that you can draw it all out from them, and you soon realise that actually you explicitly need to do quite a lot of legwork there, particularly on knowledge base. So thank you very much for that, Andy, and speak to you soon, I suppose.
Yes.
All right. See ya.
Bye.